What if the world order that you and I take for granted was suddenly, dramatically turned on its head? This isn't science fiction. It's a very real scenario based on some recent, pretty sobering analysis. Welcome to the Great Unravelling.
To really grasp the shock of what happened, we've got to start with the dream. More than 60 years ago, President Kennedy launched USAID with these incredible words. He laid out this vision for a world built on, well, shared humanity, a world of mutual support. That was the baseline. But what happens when that vision is just shattered?
Well, it all started with a name that sounds like it was ripped straight out of a political thriller: the Monday Afternoon Massacre. This. This was the moment the unraveling truly began. Okay, so picture this. A new administration takes office, and in just 10 days, two huge decisions are made. First, the United States pulls out of the Paris Climate Accord, again. And second, a sudden, immediate stop to all funding for USAID, which is the country's main international development agency. The shockwave from that, it was felt instantly, all across the globe. And the immediate result was, well, just chaos. Try to imagine hundreds of humanitarian programs. We're talking everything from healthcare to food security suddenly having their lifeline completely severed, with zero warning. International organizations were left scrambling, and the communities they were helping were just plunged into this state of uncertainty and, frankly, fear. So look, it's really crucial we move past the high-level policy talk. Let's dig into the real human cost, where these abstract decisions in a faraway capital land with absolutely devastating force on the lives of everyday people. Okay, so think about the most essential services, the very bedrock of a community's health. In West Africa, you have these maternal health care clinics. Shuttered, just like that. The African Women's Health Initiative, which provided life-saving care to expecting mothers in really remote areas, was forced to close its doors for good. Or think about the small-scale farmers who are right on the front lines of our changing climate. There were all these programs helping them adapt to crazy, unpredictable rains and longer droughts. Defunded. And look, this didn't just hurt individual farmers. No, it completely destabilized food security for entire regions. It left the most vulnerable people in the world even more exposed than they already were. And then you have the invisible battles, the fight against modern slavery, the networks of people dedicated to rescuing and helping victims dismantled. In Southeast Asia, the Freedom Network just stopped. A vital support system for victims of human trafficking, it just vanished. It left people in the most desperate situations imaginable with absolutely nowhere to turn. But this wasn't just about cutting budgets. That's way too simple. To really understand why this happened, you have to look deeper. This was an ideological battle, a very deliberate shift in what the country was choosing to stand for. And the motivations? They were crystal clear. This was described as a direct attack on what we call diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI initiatives. Policies that are meant to ensure everyone gets a fair shake. There was also a specific order to end anything and everything related to what was termed gender ideology. We'll get to that in a second. This whole thing led to a purge of really experienced professionals from USAID and a hard pivot toward prioritizing the fossil fuel industry. It all fits into this much broader global trend of a certain kind of nationalism and isolationism. So what idea was being targeted? Well, at its core, it's the concept of gender as a social construct. This definition from the source material breaks it down pretty clearly. It's not about biology, it's the idea that gender is a kind of story, a script really, that's built by our history, our culture, and by power. It tells us how to act, how to be, what roles we're allowed to have. And this very idea became a primary target. Now, this ideological battle, it also connects to much bigger systemic issues. Some analysts argue that these actions are totally in line with what they see as the built-in contradictions of capitalism. I mean, look at this table. The endless pursuit of profit, it can lead to environmental destruction. The concentration of wealth in fewer and fewer hands, that can fuel a lot of social resentment. A huge focus on individualism can weaken community bonds. And major corporate influence can start to undermine democracy itself. These currents can create really fertile ground for the kind of social backlash we're talking about. But here's the really big question, right? How does a shift this radical, this damaging, actually happen without provoking a massive, sustained backlash? How does a society just absorb these kinds of shocks?
Well, that brings us to a really fascinating and honestly pretty chilling concept, a system of silence. The term for this is hypernormalization. It was first used to describe the final years of the Soviet Union. It's this weird state where everybody, and I mean everybody, from the top officials down to the average citizen, they all know the system is broken, but they all participate in this collective performance, the shared illusion, pretending that everything's fine. And this makes real change impossible because just admitting there's a crisis becomes the biggest taboo of all. And this quote just nails the feeling of it. It's not some big sudden collapse. It's a quiet, almost imperceptible absorption of the absurd into the realm of the ordinary. The things that should be outrageous just slowly become part of the background noise of everyday life. The philosopher Michel Foucault gives us a really powerful tool to understand how this works. It's his concept of power knowledge. The big idea here is that knowledge, what we think of as truth, isn't neutral. It's actually created and shaped by our conversations, by our media, by the stories we tell. And controlling that story, that narrative, is an exercise of power. So if you can control the narrative, you can control what an entire society accepts as truth. You can normalize almost anything. And you can actually see the path to this normalization unfold in a few clear steps. First, political norms get shattered, again and again. Then the media often frames these huge existential threats as just another routine political debate. One side says this, the other side says that. The public, just bombarded by constant crises, gets crisis fatigue and starts to tune out. And then finally, the outrageous actions just blend into the background. So what happens after the shock? I mean, what does the world actually look like in the aftermath of this kind of retreat? This brings us to our final section, a world that is forced to recalibrate. Well, this chart really shows you the immediate geopolitical consequence. When a major power like the US steps back from the world stage, it doesn't just leave an empty space. It creates a power vacuum. And as you can see, other powers like China and Russia, well, they don't waste any time expanding their own economic and military influence to fill that gap. And the consequences of that vacuum are a cascade. Longtime allies start to seriously question American reliability. The very trust that underpins international cooperation starts to erode. As we just saw, rival powers expand their reach. The rest of the global community is left scrambling to fill these massive funding gaps. And in so many places, years, sometimes decades of hard-won progress and development are just erased. And that leaves us with this one final profound question. Is a crisis like this an enduring defeat, a moment where the world fractures and progress is lost for a generation? Or, and this is the interesting part, could it, paradoxically, be a catalyst, a really painful wake-up call that forces other nations and communities to build more self-sufficient, more resilient systems so they're no longer dependent on a single, unpredictable power? The answer to that, well, it remains unwritten.